Hello and welcome to part 2 of the F1 Split series. If you haven't already, watch part 1 of this series which covers the breakaway championship itself. This video focuses on what the 2010 Formula 1 season would look like had the rumored breakaway series actually gone ahead. Firstly, let's look at the rules and regulations of this alternative F1 2010 season since there will be some crucial differences. Originally, the 2010 F1 season was supposed to see the introduction of a £30 million budget cap, which was only abandoned to prevent the breakaway happening. But since the breakaway series happens in this scenario, I think that the budget cap will be implemented, which should massively benefit the new teams in the long term. F1 also planned to increase technical freedom for teams running under the budget cap, such as adjustable wings and no rev limiter for the engine, so the cars should look more different from each other, although it's difficult to know what directions the teams would have gone with these rules. Also, controversially, I am going to add in another rule: spec engines. Bernie Ecclestone has made it clear in interviews that he would have liked all the teams to run the same engine, and with all of the manufacturers leaving to join the Grand Prix World Championship, this would leave Cosworth as the sole engine supplier left in Formula 1. The only team that would be affected by this is Force India, who would have to switch from Mercedes to Cosworth engines. I do wonder if Cosworth would have the capacity to make engines for all the teams, but the only alternative is if some other independent engine manufacturers like AER or Mechachrome quickly made engines. One final major change I'll make will be the FIA presidency. In reality, the teams agreed to not go ahead with their breakaway series if Max Mosley didn't run for re-election, which led to John Todt becoming the FIA president. However, since the teams have broken away in this timeline, there isn't anything stopping Max Mosley from running for re-election, and I think that he would probably win it, which should make Bernie Ecclestone happy. Next, let's move on to the calendar, which will look very similar to the real one, but without the British and Canadian Grand Prix since they both joined the Grand Prix World Championship. I will replace them with the French Grand Prix at Paul Ricard, where Bernie Ecclestone might try out his sprinkler system idea he wanted to spice up the on-track action, and the Eiffel Grand Prix at the Nürburgring, who were biannually hosting the German Grand Prix at this point. Interestingly, this would lead to Germany getting 3 Grand Prix races in 2010, with the other 2 being the F1 German Grand Prix at Hockenheim and the GPWC German Grand Prix at Eurospeedway. This could lead to F1 changing their calendar to keep their German races further away from each other. Now let's look at the grid. Williams and Force India were the only returning teams from the 2009 season, with the other 8 joining the Grand Prix World Championship. These 2 would probably prefer being frontrunners in F1 rather than midfielders in a new series anyway. Next, we have the 4 new teams of 2010 who will be more competitive due to the budget cap and lack of entries. Virgin Racing will remain unchanged compared to the real 2010 season, with drivers Timo Glock and Lucas de Grassi. Hispania Racing Team would also have the same driver lineup of Bruno Senna and Karan Chandhok, but the Indian driver is a lot less likely to be dropped mid-season due to the budget cap. Lotus will need to hire a different driver alongside Jono Trulli since Heikki Kovalainen is in the GPWC. From my research, Takuma Sato would have been the next choice for Lotus, so I will give him the second Lotus seat, meaning that this would be the first time the Japanese driver raced in F1 since 2008 when Super Aguri disappeared. Next is US F1, who would make it to F1 thanks to the budget cap. The American team had planned to run James Rossiter, a British driver who spent many years as a test driver for teams like Honda and Super Aguri, and Jose Maria Lopez, but I placed Lopez at Lola in the GPWC. From my research, it sounds like US F1 would hire American driver Jonathan Summerton, who had driven for Team America in the A1 GP series. Next, we will move on to the other new teams to fill out the grid. While only 4 new teams were granted entry into Formula 1 in the real world, there were many other groups who applied to enter F1 in 2010, such as ProDrive, Lola, and Stefan GP, who I think would enter GPWC. So here are some more teams that I think would be most likely to enter F1. The first is Superfund, an Austrian investment group who were collaborating with former F1 driver Alex Vers, who would be the team principal. They had already built a car for a cancelled feeder series, so we have an idea of what their livery would have looked like. Next is Epsilon Euskadi from the Basque region of Spain, who had previously raced in Formula Renault 3.5 and the European Le Mans series. They had also already begun work on a wind tunnel model of their F1 car. This would make them the third F1 team to have a base in Spain alongside HRT and US F1, who planned on having a base in Aragon alongside their American headquarters. Thirdly, we have the controversial Formtech, who had bought the assets of Super Aguri and tried to enter F1 under the Brabham name, without their permission. This led to the Brabham family taking legal action against Formtech. Personally, I think that Bernie Ecclestone would step in to make sure Formtech could use the Brabham name in a desperate attempt to make sure there is another big-name team on the grid. Then we have iSport, who were a British team racing in GP2 at the time and were looking to make the step up into Formula 1, similar to Manor Motorsport, who ran under the Virgin Racing name. Finally, we have two entries that I have decided to combine together. RML, who were running Chevrolet's World Touring Car program, were looking at entering Formula 1 in 2010. They had the facilities to build the race cars, but didn't have the money. On the other hand, the old March F1 team had lodged an entry which was owned by Andrew Fitton, who also owned the Swindon Town Football Club at the time. March had the money but no facilities, so I think that it would make sense for these two groups to collaborate and run the March F1 team operated by RML. So who would drive for these extra new teams? None of them announced their driver lineups, so I am going to take some educated guesses based on drivers who were aiming to race in F1 in 2010 but didn't get a seat. For Super Fund, I will make team principal Alex Verza driver, since he had been a test driver for Brawn the previous season and had just won Le Mans with Peugeot. Alongside him will be Ralf Schumacher, who was looking at making a comeback just like his older brother. Epsilon Euskadi will have Nelson Piquet Jr., who had previously driven for Renault, and Andy Soucek, who had won the Parma Formula 2 Championship in 2009. Brabham will have Nick Heidfeld, who had previously driven for BMW Sauber, and rally legend Sebastian Loeb, who was looking at making the switch to Formula 1 in 2010 with Toro Rosso before they decided to retain both of their 2009 drivers. iSport will have Christian Klein, who had last driven for Red Bull in 2006, and Bertrand Baguette, who had won the 2009 Formula Renault 3.5 Championship. And finally, March RML will have Anthony Davidson, who had last driven for Super Aguri in 2008, and Portuguese driver Álvaro Parente, who had won the Formula Renault Championship back in 2007. So here is the new F1 2010 grid. What do you think? Personally, I thought it reminded me of early Formula E seasons. It certainly doesn't look as impressive as the GPWC lineup from the same season. So how would the season go? Well, I imagine there would be plenty of negative reception to the quality of the grid, but I think the on-track action should still be good. Similar to how Red Bull and Mercedes were in 2021, I imagine that Williams and Force India would be quicker than everyone else, with their two main drivers Rubens Barrichello and Adrian Sutil fighting for the World Championship, while teammates Nico Hülkenberg and Vitantonio Luzzi would get a few wins throughout the season. In the real world, Barrichello and Sutil drew on points, so it would be a close championship fight. I imagine a lot of focus would be put on the experience and age of Rubens Barrichello and the youth and rawness of Adrian Sutil. After years of playing second fiddle to other drivers, could Rubens Barrichello step out of the shadows and finally become world champion? Or would Adrian Sutil become the unexpected successor to Michael Schumacher as the next German world champion? Personally, I think that the 2010 Formula 1 world champion would be Rubens Barrichello, making the Brazilian the most experienced driver to ever win the World Championship in his 18th season in F1. The Brazilian would be less error-prone, and Force India would be slower than they were in reality because they would have to use the Cosworth engines. Further down the grid, it's hard to tell how well all of the new teams would have done, but to bring up 2021 again, I imagine that one or two races would be won by one of these new teams. Off-track, I think Bernie Ecclestone and Max Mosley would begin work on how to attack the Grand Prix World Championship. One example I could think of is if they could threaten to revoke the FIA grade license of any track that hosts a round of the GPWC, which would prevent them from hosting any other car racing outside of the GPWC. I also think a lawsuit would be filed against the GPWC for plagiarism. The FOM and FIA had copyrighted the F1 regulations, which the GPWC would now be using in their own series. The GPWC's legal department would probably say otherwise, but off-track, I think that the relationship between the Grand Prix World Championship and the FIA would get very toxic very quickly and would be a huge talking point amongst fans and journalists. So what do you guys think about this alternative 2010 F1 season? Would you have watched it? How would it compare to the GPWC? Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.